He had lived through 3 wars, lost his wife and home, but every Sunday morning he still washed his old uniform in the river. They called him the old man with the cans. When he stole a bun because he was hungry, he was arrested. But everything changed in court, because someone finally looked at his medals. What was revealed in the courtroom? And how will the story of the soldier whom everyone forgot end? Staff Sergeant Henry Lowell was never the loudest man in a room, but when he spoke, others listened. He had the kind of voice that rolled like distant thunder, steady and full of weight, shaped by years shouting commands over the roar of artillery and engines. In uniform, he stood like a pillar, his shoulders squared by discipline, his jaw carved from resolve. For over 30 years, he served with honor, 2 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan, 1 in Kosovo before that. He was the man who stayed behind to cover the retreat. The one who volunteered for the shift no one wanted. The one who carried his men's photos even after their bodies were flown home. He had a wife once, Clara. She waited for him through deployments and sent handwritten letters scented with lilac perfume. She was the rhythm beneath his order, the warmth he came home to. Their house in the Midwest was modest, beige siding, a flag on the porch, wind chimes that never stopped singing in the spring. But service asks more than blood. It asks time. And when Henry finally retired at 70, he found his knees wouldn't stop aching and his ears had lost the range of birdsong. Still, he felt proud. He'd done his part. Now he could finally rest. Clara, though, had grown quiet. Her hands trembled when she poured tea. Her smiles dimmed. A doctor told them it was nothing, just age. But she kept losing weight, her skin graying like old paper. 3 months later, she collapsed folding laundry. By the time the ambulance arrived, her breath was shallow, her eyes unfocused. It was cancer. And worse, it had spread. You said it was nothing, Henry growled in the VA hospital hallway, knuckles white around his folder of records. You told us not to worry. The nurse couldn't meet his eyes. Neither could the doctor. She passed away in the early hours of a rainy Tuesday. Henry was holding her hand. Her last words were, "You came home." He did. But nothing about home remained. Without Clara, the house felt like a hollow shell, a monument to a life paused mid-sentence. Bills piled up. He tried to claim his pension, but some glitch in the system flagged him as ineligible pending verification. A file error. A lost document. A case number passed between desks. We're looking into it, Mr. Lowell. Please be patient. He was patient. For 6 months. Then the mortgage defaulted. He called. He wrote letters. He visited the VA office, standing in line behind men half his age, listening to keyboard clicks and indifferent voices. At one point, a young man behind the desk leaned forward and said, "Sir, have you considered applying for food assistance? Or temporary shelter?" Henry stared at him. "I was on Hill 437. You ever heard of that?" The clerk blinked. "Is that a hospital?" "No. It was where I dragged 3 wounded men out under fire. One of them turned 20 the next day." Silence. The young man cleared his throat and handed him another form. Eventually, Henry packed a single duffel bag and locked the house one last time. He left behind Clara's rocking chair, her sewing kit, a kitchen that still smelled faintly of cinnamon. The bank would take it soon. He headed toward the city. Toward anonymity. Toward survival. But even as he stepped into the shadows, he wore his dog tags beneath his shirt. And every Sunday, he washed his old uniform, the only one he kept, in the river behind the stadium. He didn't wear it. Not anymore. But he never let it get dirty. The city had no interest in who Henry Lowell had been. In this place, names weren't remembered, only shapes and shadows. He became one more figure on the sidewalk, hunched beneath an army surplus coat, pushing a squeaky shopping cart with one bent wheel. Inside the cart were bottles and cans, clinking reminders of yesterday's excess. That's how the regulars near the stadium came to call him, the old man with the cans. No one asked about the medals stitched into the lining of his coat. No one noticed the careful way he folded his belongings, or how his boots, worn to the sole, were still polished every Sunday. These were habits that lingered long after purpose disappeared. Each day, he made the same quiet rounds, from the alley behind the pizza place to the sidewalk near the train station, to the back gates of the sports arena. He had a route. A code. He never begged, never shouted, never took more than his share from a recycling bin. On cold days, he wrapped his hands in duct tape and gritted his teeth against the wind. On warm ones, he soaked a rag in river water and wiped down his face, his neck, the backs of his ears, a ritual of dignity he refused to let go. Some nights, he slept behind the utility shed behind the stadium, curled beneath cardboard and tarps. Others, he walked until his feet gave out. Walking was better. It kept the memories from creeping in. Occasionally, a kind soul would notice. A student once left a thermos of coffee beside his cart, nodding without speaking. A janitor at the train depot sometimes passed him half a sandwich. Once, a boy gave him a pack of gum and said, "My grandpa was a soldier too." That one stayed with him. He spoke rarely. When he did, his voice was low, precise. He addressed others with sir and ma'am, out of habit, even if they glanced away in discomfort. He avoided police, kept to the shadows. It was easier that way. The uniformed men who once stood beside him were now uniforms of another kind, younger, sharper, less likely to look twice. Still, every Sunday, like clockwork, he washed his old uniform. Behind the stadium, where the river ran shallow and brown, Henry would kneel and dip the sleeves into the water. He scrubbed with a bar of soap worn down to a stub. He'd lay the jacket flat on a stone to dry, its faded patches catching the morning sun. He didn't wear it anymore, not in public. But he couldn't bring himself to throw it away. It was the only proof left that he had once been seen. One afternoon, as he knelt by the riverbank, a woman walking her dog paused a few feet away. She looked down at the uniform, then at Henry, then quickly back to her phone. She took a picture. He didn't say anything. The photo ended up online, under the caption, "Homeless man washes his army jacket in the river." Heartbreaking. It was shared, reposted, forgotten within hours. But Henry never knew. He didn't have a phone. He barely existed on paper. And the only screen he looked at was the reflection of his hands in the river. At the shelter downtown, he stopped going. Too crowded. Too loud. Too many stares when he flinched in his sleep. He didn't want pity, just quiet. So he stuck to the places no one else wanted. A bench behind a pawn shop. A patch of dirt beneath the overpass. The concrete steps near an abandoned church. Every few weeks, he tried the VA again. Sat in the waiting room. Explained his case. Handed over worn copies of old documents. But every time, the result was the same, a shrug, a computer screen, a printout he couldn't read because his glasses had cracked 2 winters ago. Case still pending, sir. Sir. They still called him that. But it meant nothing now. Once, a man in the waiting room asked if he'd ever been in combat. Henry looked at him and said quietly, "I'm not sure I ever left it." The men didn't ask again. The cold came early that year. October bit like January. Henry's gloves had long since lost their lining, and his socks were thin as paper. His breath fogged as he walked the cracked sidewalk outside the 24-hour convenience store, eyeing the shelves through the smeared glass. His stomach twisted. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. The shelter had closed its doors the night before, full. The men at the stadium who sometimes slipped him half a hot dog hadn't shown. Henry had searched every recycling bin within a mile and barely filled half his bag. Just 12 cans. 24 cents. The clerk inside the store didn't even look up when the door chimed open. Henry shuffled in slowly, eyes down, trying not to draw attention. The warm air hit his face like sunlight, and for a brief second, he stood still, soaking in its comfort. There it was, the bread rack. A few stale rolls in a clear plastic bag. Cheap. Forgotten. Almost expired. His fingers hovered. Then he took it. Quick. Smooth. Tucked under the coat, where his service ribbons once were. He turned to leave. Didn't run. Just moved toward the door with practiced calm. "Hey." The voice was sharp. The clerk had noticed. Footsteps. A shout. The sound of a button pushed. Panic rose in Henry's throat, but he didn't move faster. He couldn't. His knees were brittle with cold and time. By the time he reached the corner of the block, blue lights painted the sidewalk. A cruiser screeched up beside him. "Sir, put the item down and place your hands where we can see them." Henry froze. A young officer stepped out. She couldn't have been more than 25. Her hand rested on the holster, unsure. Behind her, the older partner moved with silent authority. "Name?" the partner asked, already pulling out a notepad. Henry's voice was flat. "Lowell. Henry J. Age. 72. The younger officer glanced at his coat, at the duct-taped boots, at the bag of cans. She looked uncomfortable. The older cop wasn't fazed. "You know what you did?" "I took bread," Henry said. "Because I was hungry." "You understand that's theft?" Henry didn't answer. Instead, he slowly reached inside his coat, carefully, deliberately, and pulled out the bag. Then, from beneath his second shirt, something else dangled on a chain, a pair of dog tags. They clinked softly in the wind. The young officer's eyes caught on them. "Are those real?" she asked. Henry said nothing. The partner didn't even look. "Let's get him in the car. We'll figure the rest out at the station." As they led him away, the bread bag still in his hands, the young officer hesitated. She lingered by the back door of the cruiser, watching him with a strange expression, something between doubt and guilt. "Sir," she asked softly, "were you really in the military?" Henry looked at her through the smeared window. His face was lined with windburn and dignity. He nodded once. "I wasn't stealing," he said. "I was surviving." At the precinct, they processed him like any other suspect. Fingerprints. A mugshot. Property logged. No one asked about the dog tags. No one cared that the bread cost less than $2. To them, he was just another old man who crossed the line between desperation and crime. They placed him in a holding cell. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. The walls smelled of bleach and sweat. A bench, a toilet, and silence. Henry sat with his back straight, eyes forward. Not defiant. Not ashamed. Just waiting, as he had so many times before. The courtroom was colder than the holding cell. Morning light filtered in through tall, dust-frosted windows, casting long shadows across the pew-like benches. The old radiator clanked in the corner, struggling to keep up. The bailiff called names like roll call in a ghost platoon. Most defendants looked down, tired and sullen. But Henry Lowell sat straight, hands folded, eyes forward. He was wearing a faded olive shirt, one button missing near the collar. His dog tags were hidden beneath the fabric now, a secret memory against his chest. The paper bag with the roll of bread sat on the table next to his public defender, untouched. The judge, a lean woman in her 60s, adjusted her glasses and glanced at the case summary. Henry J. Lowell. Charged with petty theft. Value, $1. 85, prior arrests, none. Age, 72. She paused. "Mr. Lowell, how do you plead?" Before the public defender could speak, Henry did. "Guilty, Your Honor. But not ashamed." There was a rustle in the gallery. The judge raised an eyebrow. "Explain." Henry stood. No theatrics. No trembling. Just the practiced poise of someone who once gave orders over gunfire. "I served 34 years in the United States Army," he began. "My pension was lost in a system that no longer recognizes my name. My wife died waiting on a diagnosis that came too late. I've lived on the streets for 5 years. I don't steal. I survive. That bread was 2 days' worth of meals." The judge leaned back, silent. Her eyes didn't soften, but they sharpened. She wasn't used to this kind of clarity. The courtroom had grown still. Near the back row, a woman in a brown VA jacket sat up straighter. Her name was Carla Monroe, a veterans advocate who'd been called to observe cases with potential eligibility claims. She'd read thousands of files over the years. But something in the man's voice made her open her binder and flip to a flagged but unresolved file. Lowell, Henry J. She scanned quickly. Artillery Division. Bronze Star. Tour in Mosul, 2004. Honorable Discharge, 2012. Pension request denied, error code 52A, verification file missing. Her breath caught. She rose quietly and moved to the front, motioning to the court clerk. The judge noticed and raised her chin. Yes, ma'am. Carla Monroe, Veterans Assistance Office, she said. Your Honor, I believe this man's service file has been misfiled. I have a copy of the original request. It was never resolved. The judge gestured for the document. Carla walked to the bench, handed over the sheet, then turned and looked directly at Henry. Her voice lowered as she spoke, not to the judge, but to him. You're not invisible here, Staff Sergeant. Henry's face didn't change, but his throat moved, just once, as if something had caught there. The public defender blinked. Staff Sergeant. Yes, Carla said. Confirmed. 3 combat tours. Multiple commendations. Should have been receiving full benefits for the last 5 years. The judge sat back. Then why hasn't he? A clerical error. No follow-up. His appeal was marked pending and archived. The courtroom buzzed again, a tide of murmurs swelling in the back rows. The judge struck her gavel once. Silence. She turned to Henry. Mr. Lowell, we'll dismiss this charge pending review. I'm ordering a full investigation into your benefits claim and a temporary housing placement. Ms. Monroe, can you assist? Carla nodded. Henry remained standing. His hands were shaking slightly now, but he didn't sit. Thank you, Your Honor, he said. Then, quieter, to no one in particular, I didn't want to be special. Just counted. For the first time that day, the judge let silence linger. Then she said, almost gently, you were counted. Just not by the people who should have done it first. Henry nodded once and sat back down. Outside the window, sunlight cracked through the gray. And in a file cabinet somewhere, a long-forgotten name had finally been pulled into the light. The wheels of bureaucracy moved slowly, but this time, they moved for Henry Lowell. 3 days after the hearing, he was escorted to a temporary veteran shelter by Carla Monroe herself. It wasn't glamorous, chipped walls, low ceilings, a shared bathroom, but the bed was warm, the door locked from the inside, and there was hot soup every night. The first time Henry sat down at the dining table with other men his age, each in varying shades of broken, he said nothing. He just listened. And then, finally, someone asked his name, and listened back. Carla worked fast. She pulled every file, called every contact. Within a week, Henry's status with the Department of Veterans Affairs was officially reinstated. Pension payments, retroactive 5 years, were scheduled for release. His VA medical card arrived in the mail, printed fresh with his name and ID number, valid, active, verified. When Carla handed him the envelope, Henry held it for a long time without opening it. What's wrong? She asked. I thought I'd forgotten how to belong, he said. Turns out I just forgot how it felt to be seen. The story didn't stay quiet. Someone in the courtroom had posted a video clip, just 30 seconds of Henry's speech, just his voice saying, I didn't want to be special. Just counted. It spread fast. Veterans groups reposted it. A local news anchor interviewed Carla. Then the national news called. The Department of Defense issued a brief statement about a reconciliation in progress. It was thin, bureaucratic, but it was something. Henry's name was back in the system. But now it was also in the conversation. A week later, a man approached him outside the shelter, middle-aged, clean-cut, eyes wide with hesitation. You're Lowell, right? Staff Sergeant. Henry nodded cautiously. My father served under you. Afghanistan. Said you pulled him out after an IED hit the convoy. The man pulled a folded photo from his coat. It showed a younger Henry, unshaven, face streaked with ash, one arm around a wounded soldier. He didn't remember the photo being taken. He always kept this, the man said. Said it reminded him that someone still had his back. He passed last year, but I thought you should have it. Henry held the photo like a fragile medal. His fingers trembled. Thank you, he said, voice barely above a whisper. Word reached the stadium, too. The manager who'd once dismissed him as a nuisance made a public apology. The team issued a statement honoring local veterans, and at halftime the following Sunday, they invited Henry to stand on the field. He declined the spotlight but agreed to attend, from the stands. Carla sat beside him. When his face appeared on the jumbotron, a murmur rippled through the crowd, followed by something rare and quiet, respectful silence. People stood. They didn't cheer. They just rose. No applause. No fireworks. Just reverence. After the ceremony, as they walked toward the exit, Carla turned to him. You okay? Henry didn't answer right away. He looked up, not at the crowd, but at the sky, clear and blue. I used to think I'd die with nothing, he said. Now I know the truth. I lived with everything, it was just buried for a while. Carla smiled. You did more than live, Henry. You endured. And you waited for the rest of us to catch up. Back at the shelter, he pulled out his uniform for the first time in years, still clean, still folded. He ran a hand over the fabric, pausing at the faded patch above the chest, Lowell. It still fit. A little tight around the shoulders. But it fit. The next morning, a housing placement was confirmed. A modest one-bedroom apartment downtown, part of a new veteran support complex. He'd be moving in within a week. He walked back to the river one last time. The same place where he had once knelt, scrubbing sleeves in silence. This time, he didn't bring the uniform. Just stood there, letting the wind roll off the water and whisper through the trees. Even the coldest winters end, he murmured. And this one's over. The apartment was small, but it was his. Pale blue walls, a kitchen with a working stove, and a window that caught the morning light just right. A new bed stood in the corner, firm and unfamiliar, the kind you had to earn comfort with. There were no medals on the wall. No military posters or flags. Just a photo on the nightstand, Clara, smiling in the garden, her face lit by spring. The first morning, Henry woke before dawn, as he always had. He sat at the edge of the bed and listened to the silence. Not the cold silence of alleys or courtrooms, but a softer, gentler kind. The kind that didn't press on your chest. He brewed coffee. Real coffee. He poured it into a chipped mug the shelter staff had let him keep. On the windowsill, a small plant bent slightly in the breeze from the cracked pane. There was a knock at the door around noon. He opened it to find a young woman in her 30s, holding a canvas tote bag and wearing a nervous smile. Uncle Henry, she asked. It took him a moment. The eyes. The chin. Clara's nose. Rebecca, he said. She nodded. I saw you on the news, she said, stepping inside with hesitation. I remember you from when I was little, you and Aunt Clara used to send me letters. Henry cleared his throat. You've grown. They sat for hours, catching up on decades. She told him about her daughter, about her job at a community clinic. She didn't ask about the street or the bread or the court. She only asked what he needed. I don't need much, he said. But, it's good to hear my name again. Later that week, there was a ceremony at the local Veterans Center. Nothing grand. No cameras. Just a small gathering of former soldiers and community members. They asked Henry to say a few words. He stood in his clean uniform, hands clasped behind his back. I don't speak for all veterans, he began, but I know what it feels like to be forgotten. To feel like your service was a story no one wanted to hear. He paused, his voice steady. But stories don't end when the war does. Some of us carry our battles long after the battlefield's gone. And what we need, more than parades, more than medals, is to be seen. Counted. Remembered. Silence followed. Then a man in the back rose and gave a slow, deliberate salute. One by one, others followed. No clapping. No applause. Just stillness. And respect. That evening, Henry returned home. He took off the uniform, folded it with care, and placed it gently at the bottom of his closet. Not because he was ashamed, but because he no longer needed it to prove who he was. He sat on the bed, the photo of Clara in his hands. "I found my way back," he whispered. "Just like you promised." Outside, the sky faded into soft pinks and purples. A breeze rustled the leaves. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once and fell quiet again. Henry leaned back, closed his eyes, and let the weight lift from his shoulders. And for the first time in years, he slept through the night, not as a ghost, not as a relic, but as a man at peace.